The Christmas lights glittered like diamonds on a corpse. I stood in the grand foyer of Meyer's boutique, my family's legacy, every gem I'd sketched since childhood now sparkling under chandeliers paid for by my unpaid labor. 58 years old, and my parents beamed as they handed my younger sister Rebecca the velvet box. "Open it, darling," Mother cooed. Rebecca lifted the lid. Inside, the deed to the store signed sealed mine no more. Father turned to me, eyes soft with pity. "Ellie, sweetheart, you're just not built for success." The room erupted in applause. Relatives toasted. I felt the floor tilt. My designs, my nights, my name erased in one sentence. I walked out into the blizzard without a coat. Snow stung like truth. 6 months later, their phones rang off the hook. Contracts canceled. Inventory seized. The boutique hemorrhaging. Father's voice cracked on the line, "Ellie, please, save us." I smiled into the silence. Success isn't for me, remember? But here's the promise. Stay until the end. You'll watch me forge a single raw diamond into a weapon sharper than betrayal. You'll see the sister who stole my empire polishing benches under my name. And when the final twist drops like snow burying their lies, you'll feel the same fire that kept me alive. Because this isn't just revenge, it's resurrection. My name is Eleanor Grace Myers, though most folks just call me Ellie. At 58, I've spent more than 40 years pouring my heart into Myers Boutique, the family jewelry store my parents built from a tiny workshop into a gleaming landmark on Chicago's Magnificent Mile. I never drew a salary, never asked for one. Designing every signature piece, sketching the swirling M logo that graces our windows, and polishing stones until my fingers ached, was my way of proving I belonged in the legacy. The evening of December 24th, 2023. The boutique shimmered like a jewel box itself. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms across polished mahogany cases, and the scent of fresh pine mingled with the metallic tang of gold. Relatives in sequins and tuxedos sipped champagne, while a string quartet played "Oh Holy Night." I wore the navy velvet dress I'd sewn myself, the one with tiny seed pearl buttons I'd hand-set the week before. Mother had insisted on a family portrait moment, so I stood near the central display, our holiday centerpiece, a sapphire necklace I'd designed at 16, smiling until my cheeks hurt. Rebecca glided in late, as always, her red silk gown catching every light. At 49, she still turned heads the way she had in high school when Father first started grooming her for the spotlight. She kissed cheeks, accepted compliments, and positioned herself beside our parents like a queen claiming her throne. I told myself the flutter in my stomach was just holiday nerves. Father tapped his glass. The quartet hushed. Conversation died. "We have a surprise," he announced, voice warm with practiced charm. Mother's eyes sparkled brighter than the diamonds around her neck. A gift that honors the future of Myers Boutique. My pulse quickened. For months, whispers had floated about a commemorative plaque, something to acknowledge my decades behind the scenes. I'd even overheard the engraver on the phone. I smoothed my skirt, ready to step forward when they called my name. Father extended a velvet box toward Rebecca. "Not me." "Rebecca." She lifted the lid with theatrical slowness. Inside lay a single sheet of heavy cream paper embossed with the store's letterhead. Rebecca's manicured fingers trembled as she unfolded it. Her gasp sliced the room. "It's the deed," Father declared. "Myers Boutique is officially yours, Rebecca. Signed, sealed, and notarized tonight." Applause thundered. Uncle Harold whooped. Cousin Marlene dabbed her eyes. Rebecca spun in a delighted circle, the paper fluttering like a victory flag. Cameras flashed. Champagne corks popped again. I stood rooted, smile frozen. The plaque I'd imagined polished brass, my name etched in elegant script, dissolved into air. In its place, legal ink transferring everything I'd built to the sister who'd spent years jet-setting while I worked the bench. Mother finally noticed me. She crossed the floor heels clicking and cupped my face with cool fingers. "Sweetheart," she murmured loud enough for nearby cousins to hear. "You're just not built for success. Rebecca has the vision. You've always been our quiet strength." Quiet strength. The phrase landed like a slap. 40 years of quiet strength, and this was my reward. Rebecca hugged me, perfume choking. "Isn't it wonderful, Ellie? You can still design for me?" Design for her. The words echoed in my skull. I'd created every best-selling collection since 1982. The emerald tennis bracelet in the window mine. The pearl choker the mayor's wife wore to the gala mine. The swirling M that had become Chicago's most recognized luxury mark, drawn by my 14-year-old hand on graph paper. Father raised his glass again. To Rebecca, Myers owner and future of Myers Boutique, the toast rolled over me like a wave. I felt every eye measuring my reaction, waiting for gracious defeat. I managed a nod, a tight smile. Inside, something cracked clean, irreversible, the way a flawed diamond splits under pressure. I slipped through the crowd, past the sapphire necklace I'd never see again, past the display cases I'd arranged at dawn. The front door's bell chimed as I stepped into the night. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, erasing footprints the moment they formed. Michigan Avenue's holiday lights blurred into watercolor streaks. I had no coat. The cold bit instantly, but I welcomed it. Better to feel frostbite than the burn of that velvet box. I walked north, away from the boutique, away from the family portrait that no longer included me. Each step left a darker print in the snow, as if the city itself marked my exit. Behind me, laughter spilled from the warm windows. Ahead, the blizzard swallowed everything. I pressed my bare hands to my chest, feeling the rapid thud of a heart that had finally stopped asking permission. As the snow fell harder, something inside me froze forever. The snow kept falling as I walked, each flake landing on my lashes like a tiny accusation until the city lights blurred into watercolor streaks. By the time I reached the L platform, my velvet dress was stiff with ice, and my fingers had lost all feeling, but the cold had done its work. The roar in my head had quieted to a single steady pulse. I boarded the late train north, dropped a crumpled 20 into the fare box, and took the last empty seat beside a woman clutching grocery bags. She glanced at my bare arms, then away. No one spoke. That was Chicago in January, polite indifference wrapped in wool coats. I got off at Logan Square with no plan beyond the next breath. The streets were deserted plows scraping sparks along the curbs. A flickering neon sign caught my eye, Room's Weekly Vacancy. The building was a tired 3-story brick with a rusted fire escape and a lobby that smelled of boiled cabbage and bleach. Mrs. Kowalski, the landlord, met me at the door in a chenille robe and slippers shaped like Scotty dogs. She took one look at my chattering teeth and ushered me inside without questions. "Third floor back," she said, handing over a brass key on a red plastic tag. "Heat's cranky, but the locks work." I paid 3 months in advance from the coffee can cash I'd grabbed on instinct, and she slipped me a spare blanket from the linen closet. "Welcome home, hon." The apartment was smaller than the boutique's stockroom. A single window overlooked an air shaft. A hot plate sat on a formica counter scarred by decades of careless knives, and the Murphy bed groaned like an old man when I pulled it down. I stood in the middle of the linoleum floor, purse clutched to my chest, and realized I owned nothing but what I carried. The silence pressed in thick as the snow piling against the pane. I set the purse on the table, opened it, and stared at the contents wallet keys. I no longer needed a tube of lipstick the color of dried blood. No phone charger, no toothbrush, no photograph of anyone who might miss me. I had vanished as completely as if I'd stepped off the edge of the world. Sleep refused to come. I lay on the lumpy mattress, listening to pipes clank and a baby cry through the wall. At 3 a.m., I gave up brewed tea on the hot plate using a styrofoam cup and watched steam curl toward the water-stained ceiling. The tea tasted of cardboard and desperation, but it warmed my hands. Dawn crept in gray and reluctant. I dressed in the same frozen dress, walked to the corner drugstore, and bought the essentials: toothbrush, soap, a pair of men's thermal socks because the women's were sold out. The cashier, a teenager with purple streaks in her hair, rang me up without meeting my eyes. I was already invisible. Days slid into a rhythm of deliberate smallness. I rose at 6, showered in the closet-sized bathroom where the water heater coughed like a lifelong smoker, and ate oatmeal from a packet because it required only hot water. I avoided the boutique's neighborhood, taking the bus in the opposite direction to wander big-box stores where no one knew my name. I window shopped for coats I couldn't afford, tried on scarves the color of garnets, and always left empty-handed. Money was finite. Pride was not. I refused to touch the joint account I'd shared with my parents since college. Let them wonder where I'd gone. The family's silence was absolute. No missed calls, no texts, no frantic knock at the door. I checked my phone each morning out of habit, then set it face down. Rebecca, who once posted every manicure on Instagram, went dark on my feed. Mother's book club friends stopped asking after me at the grocery store. I knew because I saw Mrs. Lang in the cereal aisle, and she pretended fascination with bran flakes. The erasure was methodical surgical. I was the appendix they'd finally removed. One February afternoon, the radiator gave a death rattle and died. Mrs. Kowalski brought a space heater and a plate of pierogi, apologizing for the inconvenience. While she fiddled with the thermostat, I noticed a cardboard box wedged behind the radiator left by the previous tenant, she said, and forgotten. Curiosity overrode politeness. I dragged it into the light. The flaps were sealed with brittle tape. When I sliced it open with a butter knife, a puff of attic dust rose like a ghost. Inside lay relics of someone else's childhood. A cracked yo-yo, a stack of baseball cards, and buried beneath a spiral sketchbook with a faded unicorn on the cover. My breath caught. I'd owned one exactly like it in 1979, the year Father expanded the store, and I spent every Saturday at the drafting table. I lifted it out, heart hammering. The pages crackled as I opened them. There on the first sheet was the M logo, my M drawn in purple ink when I was 14. The swirl was tentative but unmistakable, the same curve that now glowed in neon above Michigan Avenue. Beneath it in my adolescent scrawl, property of Ellie Myers, do not touch. I sank to the floor legs, folding like paper. Page after page revealed designs I'd forgotten I'd created: a crescent moon pendant for Mother's birthday, a cuff bracelet inspired by the Art Institute's Tiffany windows, a ring shaped like intertwined vines that later became the store's bestseller in 1987. Every sketch bore my initials in the corner, tiny and fierce. I'd presented the book to Father the summer I turned 15, certain he'd frame the logo page. Instead, he'd patted my head, said, "Nice hobby," and locked the book in his office drawer. I'd assumed it was lost in one of the moves. The discovery hit like a second betrayal, deeper because it was older. They hadn't just taken the store. They'd stolen the proof that I'd ever mattered. I clutched the sketchbook to my chest, tears falling onto the unicorn cover until the colors ran. For the first time since Christmas, I cried, not the silent leaking of the past weeks, but great wrenching sobs that shook the bed springs. Mrs. Kowalski knocked once, heard the storm, and retreated. When the tears finally slowed, I wiped my face on my sleeve and opened the book again. The girl who'd drawn those lines was still alive in the margins, waiting. Night pressed against the window, the snow now a steady whisper. I moved to the sill, sketchbook in one hand, and found a stub of pencil in the junk drawer. The glass was cold against my forehead. Below, headlights crawled through the storm like cautious animals. I opened to a blank page near the back, miraculously untouched, and wrote my name. Not Ellie. Eleanor Grace. The letters emerged slowly, each one a declaration. Eleanor Grace. I wrote it larger, the E sweeping across the page like a banner. Eleanor Grace. A third time, pressing so hard the lead snapped. I stared at the broken pencil, then at the name glowing in the dim light. Something shifted inside me, small but seismic. The apartment was still cramped, the radiator still dead, the family still silent. But the sketchbook in my lap was evidence, and evidence could be a weapon. I closed the book, set it on the table like a loaded gun, and watched the snow erase the world outside. They had taken my name once, buried it under decades of deference and denial. Let's see how they like when I take it back. The words still burned on the page when the knock came, 3 measured taps, not the landlord's hurried rattle. I wiped my eyes, slipped the sketchbook under the pillow, and opened the door a cautious inch. A man stood in the dim hallway, silver hair cropped close, wearing a camel coat dusted with melting snow. His face was all angles and quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need volume to command a room. I knew him, though 30 years had carved deeper lines around eyes the color of storm glass. Daniel Hart, he said, voice low, as if the name itself might startle me. May I come in? I stepped aside. He entered without flourish, removing his gloves one finger at a time. The apartment shrank around him. Even the radiator seemed to hush. He surveyed the single chair, the hot plate, the snow pressing against the window like a living thing, then looked at me with something gentler than pity. Recognition, maybe. Or shared exile. You've lost weight, he observed. Not an accusation, simple fact. I folded my arms. People do when they stop eating Christmas leftovers. A faint smile touched his mouth. Fair. He reached into his coat and produced a small cloth pouch, the drawstring frayed from years of handling. I've carried this since the day your father locked the workshop door behind me. Thought I'd take it to my grave. Then I saw the light on in this window. He loosened the string. A rusted key slid into his palm iron, heavy the bow, shaped like a tiny clover. I'd seen its twin on Father's keyring decades ago, labeled safe in Mother's neat script. Daniel extended it toward me. Your mother left this for you in the old safe. My fingers closed around the metal. It was cold, pitted real. The safe was emptied when they renovated. Not the one in the basement, he said. The original Mosler built into the foundation. Your father bragged he'd never open it again after he fired me. Said the combination was cursed. He met my eyes. I was the curse. I turned the key over, tracing the corrosion. Daniel Hart had been Father's master goldsmith, the man who taught me to set a stone so it breathed. I was 12 when the shouting started, accusations of theft, of sabotaging a celebrity order. Daniel vanished overnight. Father told us he'd stolen inventory. The police came. Then nothing. I'd believed the story because children believe what keeps the world steady. Why now, I asked. Because you're ready, he said simply. And because I'm tired of carrying her secret. We left at dusk. Daniel drove a dented silver sedan that smelled of leather and pipe tobacco. The city slid past in sodium streaks, the boutique's neighborhood looming like a bad memory. He parked 2 blocks away behind the alley where delivery trucks once unloaded crates of findings. Snow had drifted against the service door, but the lock turned with a familiar click. Inside, the air was colder than outside, thick with disuse. Daniel produced a flashlight. The beam cut through dust motes, dancing like slow fireflies. We descended the narrow stairs to the sub-basement. The safe crouched in the corner, black iron squat, and implacable, its dial yellowed with age. I knelt, knees cracking, and fitted the key. It resisted, then gave with a reluctant groan. The door swung open on hinges that hadn't moved in 30 years. Inside lay a single object wrapped in oilcloth. I unwrapped it carefully. A raw diamond the size of a walnut glowed dully in the flashlight's beam, cloudy included but unmistakably alive. Beneath it, a folded note in Mother's handwriting, the ink faded to sepia. For Ellie. When she's ready. My throat closed. Daniel crouched beside me. She bought it the year Rebecca was born. Said it was insurance, yours, not theirs. Your father wanted to cut it for a celebrity line. She refused. Hid it here the night he fired me. I turned the stone into my palm. It was rough, imperfect waiting, like me. Daniel's voice dropped to a murmur. She came to me the week before the heart scare. Made me swear to wait until you walked away on your own. Said you'd never take what was forced on you. He paused. I watched the gala from the cafe across the street. Saw you leave. Knew it was time. The basement felt suddenly sacred, the safe a confessional. I folded the note, slipped it into my pocket with the diamond. Why help me? He stood, joints popping. Because your mother believed in you when no one else did. And because I still owe her a debt. His eyes glinted. Your father paid me in lies. I intend to settle in truth. We climbed the stairs in silence. Outside, the snow had stopped. The city lay hushed under a fresh white blanket. Daniel locked the service door, pocketed the flashlight. At the car, he opened the passenger door, then paused. One more thing, he said. Your mother wanted to give you the store. They stopped her. I won't. Daniel. Daniel's words hung in the cold air like a vow carved in ice. I stood on the sidewalk, the raw diamond heavy in my pocket, the rusted key now a talisman against my palm. The city had gone quiet, the snow muffling even the distant hum of traffic. He watched me for a long moment, then nodded once as if sealing a pact neither of us had spoken aloud. "Call when you need me," he said, and drove away, taillights fading into the white. I walked home through the hush, the diamond's edges pressing into my thigh with every step. The apartment felt different when I entered, less like a refuge, more like a war room. I set the stone on the table beside the sketchbook, its cloudy facets catching the bare bulb's light. For the first time since Christmas, I slept without dreaming of velvet boxes. March arrived with a raw wind that rattled the windows and turned the snow to slush. I had decisions to make. The coffee can cash was dwindling, and pride wouldn't pay the electric bill. I needed capital enough to rent a small studio, buy basic tools, turn the diamond into something sellable. I spent a week polishing a business plan on the back of grocery receipts. Eleanor Grace designs luxury for women who'd earned their scars. I practiced the pitch in the mirror until the words felt like armor. The bank was a glass and steel fortress on Milwaukee Avenue, all polished counters and hushed voices. I wore my one good blazer, the navy one I'd rescued from the family house, and carried a manila folder thick with projections. The loan officer, a young man named Patel with a tie too tight, listened politely as I laid out my vision. His fingers flew over the keyboard. Then his brow furrowed. "Ms. Myers," he said, turning the monitor so I could see. "There's a flag on your credit. You're listed as primary guarantor on a commercial note. Myers Boutique, $400,000, originated 5 years ago. Current balance $389. Until that's resolved, we can't extend new credit." The numbers blurred. I leaned closer. The signature at the bottom of the guarantee was mine, looping E-sharp Y, the tail on the S exactly as I'd written it since high school. Except I'd never seen the document before. The date, June 12, 2019. I remembered that day I'd been in the workshop until midnight, setting a marquise for a senator's wife. Father had asked me to sign a routine insurance update. I'd scrawled my name without reading, trusting the way you trust gravity. Patel's voice softened. "The loan's in default. Payments stopped 3 months ago. If you're not aware of this..." "I'm aware now," I said. My tongue felt thick. He printed the file. 23 pages of legalese, my forged consent buried in the fine print. The boutique's expansion, the new cases, the Milan trip Rebecca bragged about, the celebrity endorsements, all funded by a lien on my future. They'd used my clean credit, my spotless history, to borrow against a store they'd later hand to my sister like a party favor. I left the bank with the folder clutched to my chest, the wind whipping my hair across my face. The slush soaked my boots, but I barely felt it. I walked until I found a diner with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of burnt coffee. I ordered tea I didn't drink and spread the papers across the table like a crime scene. The numbers told a story colder than the snow. Father had refinanced twice, each time increasing the principal. Each time listing me as guarantor without my knowledge. The boutique's assets were pledged, but the personal guarantee meant collectors could come for my savings. My future earnings, even the apartment's meager furniture if I ever owned any. They'd built their empire on my name while telling me I wasn't built for success. I traced the forged signature with a fingertip. The curve of the E was perfect, the pressure of the pen identical to mine. Someone had practiced. Someone who watched me sign holiday cards, deposit slips, permission forms for Rebecca's school trips. Someone who knew my hand the way a counterfeiter knows a bill. The betrayal settled in my bones, heavier than the diamond. They hadn't just taken the store. They'd mortgaged my freedom to pay for it. Every sale, every glowing review, every society page photo of Rebecca at a trunk show built on debt they'd hung around my neck like a noose. I paid for the tea and walked home through the melting streets. The apartment's radiator had finally surrendered. Mrs. Kowalski left a note about a repairman coming Tuesday. I didn't care. I sat at the table, the loan file open beside the diamond, and stared at the forgery until the lines blurred. Then I opened the sketchbook to a fresh page and began to write not designs, but a plan. First, confirm the forgery. I'd need a handwriting expert quietly. Second, trace the funds. Where had the money gone? Not all into the store. Rebecca's condo in Lincoln Park wasn't cheap. Third, protect what little I had. I'd open a new account, transfer the coffee can cash, sever every financial tie. The diamond watched me, cloudy but unyielding. I turned it in my fingers, feeling the rough girdle, the potential locked inside. They'd borrowed my name to build their dream. I'd use my name to take it down. Night fell. I worked by the light of a single lamp, the city's glow filtering through frost-laced windows. The plan grew precise as a facet map. I'd start small, an online shop, one-of-a-kind pieces, the diamond as my flagship. I'd register the business under Eleanor Grace File, the trademark, build a brand they couldn't touch. And when the debt came due, when the bank foreclosed, I'd be ready. I closed the folder, set the diamond on top like a paperweight. The apartment was cold, but the chill no longer reached me. I was done being the quiet strength they leaned on. They think I'm gone. They'll learn I was just getting started. They think I'm gone. They'll learn I was just getting started. The words still burned in my chest as I locked the door of the tiny apartment, the rusted key from Daniel Hart, tucked safely in my coat pocket. Snow had begun to pile against the single window, but the chill outside could not touch the fire that had ignited inside me. I sat at the narrow kitchen table, the raw diamond resting on a scrap of black velvet like a sleeping ember. It was smaller than a dime, rough and cloudy, yet it carried the weight of every promise my mother never got to keep. I had no studio, no loop, no polishing wheel, only a borrowed Dremel tool, a cracked magnifying glass, and the stubborn refusal to let this stone stay buried. I worked in the evenings after shifts at the craft store, the hum of the motor drowning out the traffic on the avenue below. The apartment smelled of hot metal and coffee gone cold. I wrapped the diamond in tape to protect my fingers, then began the slow, terrifying process of cutting away everything that wasn't the phoenix I saw in my mind. Each facet was a memory I refused to carry forward. The gala lights, Rebecca's smug smile, the forged signature that had stolen 5 years of my credit. Dust coated my lips, but I kept going, shaping the stone into a teardrop that caught the lamplight and threw it back sharper, fiercer. When the final facet locked into place, the diamond blazed clear, a single flame trapped in crystal. I held it up to the window and watched the snowflakes scatter across the glass like applause. Silver was the only metal I could afford. I melted down a handful of old chains I'd bought for pennies at estate sales, pouring the liquid into a handmade mold I'd carved from soapstone. The bracelet took shape in my trembling hands, a slender cuff open at the back with delicate wings etched along the edges. I set the diamond in a bezel so thin it looked like the stone was floating. When I clasped it around my own wrist for the first time, the weight was perfect, neither heavy nor light, but present like a heartbeat I had forgotten I owned. I turned my arm beneath the lamp, and the phoenix caught fire, the wings seeming to lift with every breath. For the first time in months, I smiled at my reflection in the darkened window. I needed a name that would make women my age stop scrolling. I typed and deleted a dozen phrases before the right one arrived, simple and unbreakable, Eleanor Grace Designs. The website was bare bones, 1 page, 1 photograph, 1 bracelet. I uploaded the image at 2 a.m, the diamond glowing against black velvet, the silver wings catching shadows that looked like flight. Beneath it, I wrote the line that had kept me awake, luxury crafted for women who never quit. I hesitated over the price. $2,000 felt obscene for something I had made on a kitchen table, but I thought of the years I had given away for free and pressed submit. Then I closed the laptop and waited for the world to ignore me. The first ping came at dawn. I was pouring coffee when the screen lit up, order number 0001. Payment processed. Shipping address, a post office box in the neighboring county. The buyer's name read Margaret Ellison, a maiden name I had not seen in decades. My pulse stumbled. Margaret Ellison was my mother's name before she married my father. Rebecca's mother, my mother, had used it to hide her identity. I stared at the confirmation email until the letters blurred. She had found me. She had chosen the phoenix. I packaged the bracelet in a plain gray box, tied it with black ribbon, and included a handwritten card that said, "Only wear it in good health." I did not sign it. Let her wonder. By noon, the order count climbed to 7. By nightfall, 23. Women I would never meet wrote messages in the checkout notes. For my 60th birthday after the divorce. For my sister who started over at 55. For me because I deserve something beautiful. Each sale felt like a door cracking open, lights spilling into rooms I had believed were sealed forever. I printed labels until the printer begged for mercy, wrapped bracelets in tissue thin as hope, and carried armfuls of packages to the post office before the morning rush. The clerk began to recognize me. She started setting aside the larger mail trays without being asked. I kept one bracelet for myself, the prototype with the slightly crooked wing. I wore it every day, hidden beneath the sleeve of my thrift store coat. It rubbed against my skin when I lifted boxes, when I stirred soup, when I lay awake listening to the radiator clank. The stone warmed to my pulse, a secret coal that refused to die. I began to notice small changes, the way I stood straighter at the craft store counter, the way I met customers' eyes instead of looking past them. The phoenix was not just jewelry, it was evidence. If I could turn a rough stone into fire, I could turn the rest of my life into something that burned just as bright. The money arrived in steady waves, enough to replace the borrowed Dremel with a real polishing wheel, enough to rent a corner workbench in a shared studio downtown. I hired a photographer who specialized in macro shots. She made the diamond look like a galaxy trapped in silver. Orders poured in from book clubs, from retirement communities, from women who forwarded the link to daughters and granddaughters with the subject line, "This is us." I read every email twice, sometimes 3 times, letting the words settle like snow on my shoulders. One woman wrote that she had worn the bracelet to her first job interview in 20 years and gotten the offer on the spot. Another said she slept with it on because it reminded her that starting over was not the same as failing. I never told anyone the stone had come from my mother's safe, never mentioned the forged debt or the boutique that had swallowed my name. The phoenix belonged to every woman who bought it, and I wanted their stories to stay clean. But late at night, when the studio lights dimmed to a single lamp, I allowed myself one private truth. The first bracelet, the one now circling my mother's wrist under her married name, was the seed. She had reached through the dark and chosen resurrection without knowing she was watering it. I wondered if she turned the cuff in the lamplight the way I did, if she felt the wings brush her pulse and remembered the daughters she had been forced to forget. The website crashed twice from traffic. I upgraded the server with trembling fingers, then sat back and watched the map of orders spread across the country like spilled stars. California, Texas, Maine. Florida. Every pin a woman who had decided quitting was no longer an option. I printed the map and taped it above my workbench, a constellation of second chances. The phoenix was no longer mine alone. It had taken flight in hundreds of wrists, each one carrying a fragment of the fire I had kindled on a kitchen table with nothing but grief and a borrowed tool. One evening, the studio phone rang, an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, expecting another supplier. The message was brief, the voice clipped with something that might have been fear. "This is Margaret Ellison." The bracelet arrived. "It's exquisite. We need to talk." I played it 3 times, searching for threat, for triumph, for anything I could name. There was only a tremor, the sound of a woman holding herself together with both hands. I saved the message and closed the studio early. Outside, the city lights blurred into rivers of gold. I pulled my coat tight, the prototype phoenix warm against my skin, and walked into the cold with the certainty that something irreversible had begun. The sales kept climbing. Department stores sent emails with subject lines in all caps. A morning talk show wanted a segment on jewelry that tells a story. I turned them all down. The phoenix was not ready for spotlights that belonged to someone else. I had learned what happens when you build on borrowed ground. This time, the foundation would be mine, every facet cut by my own hand, every wing soldered in my own fire. I ordered more silver, more stones, more black ribbon. The apartment became a warehouse of gray boxes waiting for addresses. I hired my first assistant, a retired nurse named Gloria, who could wrap a bracelet faster than I could breathe. We worked side by side in companionable silence, two women who had outlived every reason to give up. On the night the order count crossed 1,000, I stood alone in the studio and opened the ledger. The numbers were no longer theoretical. They were rent groceries of future I could touch. I ran my thumb across the prototype cuff, the crooked wing catching on my skin like a reminder. The phoenix had risen from ashes I had not chosen, but I had shaped every feather. I thought of the boutique 2 towns away, its windows still glowing with Christmas lights that no longer belonged to me. I thought of the woman wearing my mother's stone, turning it beneath unfamiliar lamps. I thought of every wrist now carrying a piece of my refusal to stay broken. I closed the ledger and turned off the lights. The city hummed beyond the windows, alive with possibility. The phoenix was only the beginning. A single flame in a darkness I had once believed was permanent. That bracelet would soon open doors they thought forever closed to me. That bracelet would soon open doors they thought forever closed to me. But on the morning of Christmas Eve, 2 towns away, Rebecca Myers was unwrapping a gift that would slam every door she believed was hers alone. She sat at the head of the same mahogany table where my world had shattered a year earlier. The gala chandeliers replaced by softer holiday bulbs, the same relatives murmuring over eggnog and envy. Mother had placed the small gray box at Rebecca's plate with a smile that looked almost shy, the black ribbon tied in a perfect bow. Rebecca lifted the lid, expecting another trinket to add to her overflowing cases, but the silver cuff caught the candlelight and threw it back like a warning. She slipped it onto her wrist without ceremony, the way she claimed everything that was meant to be hers, and turned her hand to admire the single stone blazing at its center. The hallmark was tiny, etched inside the cuff where only someone looking for it would see EG in flowing script. Rebecca's manicured thumb brushed across the letters, and for a moment the room's chatter faded to a dull roar in her ears. She knew that stone. She had seen it once years ago when Mother had opened the old safe during a spring cleaning and let it roll across her palm like a secret. Rebecca had begged to have it set into a necklace for her sweet 16, but Mother had closed the velvet pouch and said it was promised to someone else. Now it sat against Rebecca's pulse, cut into a teardrop so perfect, it looked alive, framed by silver wings that seemed to beat with every breath. She forced a laugh, thanked Mother with the bright voice she used for investors, and reached for her champagne. The bubbles tasted suddenly metallic. All through brunch, she kept glancing at the bracelet, telling herself the resemblance was coincidence, that raw diamonds looked alike when they were small. But the cut was too precise, the fire too familiar. She excused herself before dessert, claiming a headache, and locked herself in the boutique's office with the lights off. She held the cuff beneath the desk lamp and studied the stone until her eyes watered. The inclusions were unmistakable. 3 tiny clouds in a diagonal line, the same flaw she had traced with a childish finger while Mother whispered that some things were meant to wait. Rebecca's stomach folded in on itself. She opened her laptop and searched Eleanor Grace Designs, the name she had mocked when the first email inquiries arrived from customers asking why Myers Boutique no longer carried anything like it. The website loaded, slowly taunting her with a single photograph, the phoenix bracelet against black velvet, the same stone staring back at her like an accusation. She told herself it was impossible. Ellie was gone, living in some cramped walk-up sketching greeting cards for pennies. Yet the hallmark burned into her vision, E.G. Eleanor Grace. Rebecca's fingers shook as she dialed the supplier who handled their gold findings. She demanded purity reports for the last 3 shipments, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. The man promised to email them within the hour. She paced the office, the bracelet sliding up and down her arm like a shackle. When the files arrived, she opened them one by one, scanning columns of numbers she had never bothered to read before. The first report showed 14-karat gold testing at 58.5% purity legal, but barely. The second dropped to 57.2%. The third, for the signature collection she had launched to compete with emerging designers, registered 55.8%. Below standard. Below what she had certified to every retailer who carried the Myers name. Rebecca's breath came in shallow bursts. She had signed off on those lots herself, distracted by gala planning, and the thrill of finally owning the store outright. She had trusted the new vendor because his prices were half the old ones, because father had said cutting corners was how real business worked. Now every piece in the display cases carried the potential to tarnish, to fail under a jeweler's loupe, to drag the Myers name into lawsuits and recalls. She opened the safe where the master stamps were kept and pulled out the hallmark punch for $14,000. The metal was worn, the edges soft from years of use. She compared it to the crisp EG on the Phoenix cuff. One was a promise kept. The other was a lie beginning to fray. She spent the afternoon on the phone, voice honeyed with urgency, begging the lab for expedited retests, offering double fees, triple if they could deliver before the post-Christmas rush. She emailed every major client with assurances that a routine quality check was underway, nothing to worry about, just dotting I's. But the replies trickled back slower than usual, some polite, some silent. One buyer from a Chicago department store asked pointedly why Myers pieces had started arriving lighter than spec. Rebecca closed the laptop and pressed her palms to her eyes until sparks danced. The bracelet felt heavier now, the stone pressing into her vein like it was drawing blood. By evening, the house was quiet, the relatives gone, the tree lights blinking in mechanical cheer. Rebecca sat on the showroom floor, surrounded by open drawers of inventory, running a magnet over chains, weighing pendants on the digital scale, photographing hallmarks under a macro lens. Every test confirmed the slide gold so thin, it bent under fingernail pressure settings that wobbled when touched. She lined up the failing pieces like evidence in a trial she was losing. The Phoenix bracelet lay in the center, untouched, its silver wings, gleaming with a purity she could no longer claim. She tried to remove it, but the cuff had warmed to her skin and resisted gently as if it had chosen its owner. Mother found her there at midnight, wrapped in a blanket among the wreckage of her empire. Rebecca held up the cuff without speaking. Mother's face went still the way it did when father announced bad quarterly numbers. She reached out, then let her hand fall. Rebecca's voice cracked when she asked where the stone had come from. Mother said only that it was a gift that the maker understood inheritance better than either of them ever had. Rebecca wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words tangled behind the panic rising in her throat. She saw the future unraveling, returns flooding in contracts, canceled, the boutique's sterling reputation reduced to tabloid headlines about fraud. She worked through the night drafting press releases she prayed she would never send, calculating how many pieces could be quietly melted down before anyone noticed. The lab promised preliminary results by morning. Rebecca showered at dawn, the bracelet still on her wrist because removing it felt like surrender. She dressed in the same red sheath she had worn to last year's gala armor that no longer fit. The courier arrived as she sipped coffee that tasted of ash. The envelope was thick, the lab's seal crisp. Rebecca slid it open with a letter opener shaped like a dagger. The cover page summarized the findings in merciless black ink. Systematic dilution across multiple alloy batches traceable to vendor switch 18 months prior. Recommended action, immediate recall. She flipped to the final page and froze. Beneath the technician's signature in the space marked requested by someone had typed a name she had not seen on any requisition form, Eleanor Grace. The report landed on her desk and my name was written all over it. But 3 days later, on a morning when the snow finally stopped falling, Daniel Hart knocked on my studio door with a package that would rewrite every accusation I had ever aimed at my mother. I was sanding the bezel of a new Phoenix cuff when the bell chimed the sound, sharp against the low hum of the polishing wheel. Daniel stood in the doorway, coat dusted white, holding a battered leather satchel that looked older than both of us. His eyes carried the same quiet apology they had the night he handed me the rusted key, but this time there was something gentler, almost afraid. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, set the satchel on the workbench, and told me it had come from the attic of the house where my mother used to hide when the arguments got too loud. I wiped my hands on my apron and opened the flap. Inside lay a thick bundle of envelopes tied with faded blue ribbon, each addressed to me in my mother's careful script. Eleanor Grace Myers, with the address of every apartment I had ever lived in, scratched out and rewritten until the paper tore. Beneath the letters was a slim bank folder stamped with the seal of a trust company I recognized from childhood documents I was never allowed to touch. Daniel said my mother had asked him to hold everything until the day I no longer needed protecting from the truth. He had waited, he said, because some truths only survive when the person receiving them is strong enough to carry them. I told him I wasn't sure I was that person yet, but my fingers were already untying the ribbon. The first envelope was dated 20 years earlier, the ink slightly browned at the edges. I slid it open with the same letter opener I used for supplier invoices and unfolded a single sheet. My mother's handwriting filled the page in tight, hurried lines. My dearest Ellie, today, your father signed papers that will keep the store alive, but the cost is you. I fought until my voice gave out, but the bank wanted a single heir with no liabilities, and Rebecca was already the face on the brochures. I promised myself this would be temporary. I promised myself you would understand. The words blurred as I read on each letter a confession she had never mailed because sending it would have meant admitting she had failed me. She wrote about sleepless nights pacing the upstairs hall, about hiding cash in a separate account every month from the household allowance, about teaching herself trust law from library books, so that one day the money would be mine alone. I sat on the stool and worked my way through the stack, the studio growing colder as the afternoon light faded. The letters spanned every milestone I had celebrated without her. My college graduation, the first logo I sold to a local printer, the Christmas I spent alone, because the invitation never came. She described watching me from the back row of the ceremony, wearing a hat pulled low so I wouldn't see her cry. She wrote about the night Rebecca was named president of the boutique, how she had stood in the parking lot afterward and vomited behind the dumpster because the champagne tasted like betrayal. Each envelope held a deposit slip, 500 here, 1,000 their numbers that added up slowly, painfully, until the final letter revealed the total $250,000 untouched earning interest in an account that bore only my name. Daniel poured coffee from the thermos he always carried and waited while I read the last page. In it, my mother explained the choice she had made the day the bank threatened foreclosure. Present Rebecca as the sole successor to secure the loan, or watch the store and the family name collapse into bankruptcy court. She had believed the sacrifice would buy time, that once the debt was paid she could bring me back into the fold with apologies and explanations. But the years stretched and the lie grew roots. She ended with a line that stopped my breath. I taught Rebecca to shine so brightly that no one would notice you were missing. I failed at both. I closed the letter and pressed it to my chest, feeling the paper tremble with the same rhythm as my heart. The trust folder contained a single access code and a note from the bank manager confirming the funds were liquid available the moment I walked through the door with identification. I opened the banking app on my phone and watched the balance load, $250,000. The number looked obscene next to the ledger where I tracked every dollar of Phoenix sales. I thought of the apartment I had left, the sketchbook I had rescued the nights I had eaten cereal for dinner so I could buy silver. I thought of my mother sitting at her vanity writing letters she never sent, slipping bills into an envelope while Rebecca tried on crowns downstairs. The anger I had nursed for a year cracked open, and beneath it was a grief so raw it felt like bleeding. I cried without sound, shoulders shaking, tears falling onto the ribbon until it darkened to navy. Daniel stood quietly by the window, giving me the space my mother never could. When the storm inside me quieted, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my sweater and looked at the account again. The money was freedom, yes, but it was also a bribe. I had never asked for a consolation prize for a childhood rewritten in someone else's image. I hovered over the transfer button, imagining the satisfaction of sending every cent to a women's shelter, of washing my hands of the Myers legacy entirely. But my mother's words echoed, "I promised myself you would understand." Understanding was not the same as forgiving, and I was tired of carrying only one. I closed the app without moving the money. "Redemption takes courage," I whispered to the empty studio, and the words tasted like the first honest thing I had said in months. I retied the ribbon around the letters and placed them back in the satchel next to the trust folder. The account would stay dormant a little longer, earning interest on a debt that was no longer only financial. I looked at Daniel and told him I needed time to decide what the money was worth, but I already knew part of the answer: it was worth the truth, and the truth was worth more than vengeance. Outside, the city lights began to flicker on, reflecting in the wet pavement like scattered diamonds. I slipped the satchel into the safe where I kept the master molds for the phoenix cuffs, locking away both the fortune and the forgiveness it demanded. For the first time, I wanted both. For the first time, I wanted both, and the universe answered with a phone call at 7 in the morning from a producer who said the Women of Legacy showcase needed a last-minute replacement for a designer who had canceled. She had seen the Phoenix bracelet on a morning talk show clip that went viral overnight, the one where a retired teacher wore it while announcing her new bakery. The producer's voice crackled with urgency. Live national television prime weekend slot. 20 million viewers, all women over 50 who controlled 70% of the nation's spending. I stood in the studio doorway, still holding the satchel of letters, the safe door yawning open behind me, and said yes, before fear could change my mind. The taping was in 48 hours. I hung up and stared at the prototype cuff on my wrist, the crooked wing catching the fluorescent light like a dare. I spent the next 2 days in a blur of preparation that felt less like work and more like resurrection. Gloria closed the online store temporarily so we could focus on the showcase piece, a limited edition. Phoenix cuff with a larger stone. This one, a flawless white diamond I had purchased with the first month's profits. I set it in platinum instead of silver, the metal cool and unforgiving under my torch. The wings were wider, etched with microscopic feathers that caught light from every angle. I engraved the inside band with a single word: legacy. When I clasped it around my wrist for the final fitting, the weight felt like armor forged from every year I had been told I did not belong. I chose a simple black sheath dress from the back of my closet, the one I had bought for a funeral I never attended, and let the cuff be the only color against my skin. The studio sent a car at dawn. I rode through the city with the showcase cuff in a velvet box on my lap, the driver humming along to classic rock while I rehearsed answers to questions I could not predict. The soundstage was a cavern of cables and hot lights, women in headsets rushing past with clipboards and coffee. The host, a silver-haired journalist named Claire who had interviewed presidents and pop stars, greeted me with a handshake firm enough to bruise. She studied the cuff under the makeup lights and said it looked like something a queen would wear to reclaim her throne. I laughed, surprised at the sound, and told her that was exactly the point. The audience filed in slowly, rows of women in sensible heels and statement necklaces, their eyes bright with the kind of hope that only comes after surviving disappointment. The segment began with a montage of my story. Careful edits that skipped the betrayal and focused on the kitchen table beginnings, the borrowed Dremel, the first gray box tied with black ribbon. When the camera cut to me live, I was seated on a white sofa that felt too soft, the cuff gleaming under the spotlights. Claire asked how a woman pushes past 50 and still finds the courage to start over. I told her about the night I cut the first facet, how the diamond dust looked like stardust on my fingers, how every sale felt like proof that quitting was a choice, not a sentence. The audience leaned forward, as one organism, some nodding, some wiping tears with tissues pulled from purses. I lifted my wrist and let the platinum wings catch the camera lens, the diamond throwing prisms across the set like a private fireworks show. 200 miles away, Rebecca sat on the velvet chaise in the boutique's upstairs lounge remote. In one hand, coffee gone cold in the other. The television was tuned to the showcase because Mother had insisted they watch for market research. Rebecca had rolled her eyes, expecting another parade of pastel scarves and inspirational quotes. When my face filled the screen, she froze mid-sip, the cup tilting dangerously. The camera zoomed in on the cuff, and the stone blazed with a clarity that made the failing gold in her own cases look sickly by comparison. Mother, perched on the edge of the ottoman, let out a small, involuntary sound, half gasp, half prayer. She recognized the diamond immediately. It was the twin to the one she had sent me purchased from the same inheritance lot decades earlier. Rebecca's knuckles whitened around the remote. She saw the hallmark this time without needing a loop, e.g. crisp and undeniable. The host asked about the meaning behind the phoenix. I said it was for every woman who had been told her best years were behind her, who had been traded for a younger model or a better balance sheet. I said the fire was not destruction, but refinement, that ashes were just raw material for wings. Orders began pinging on the studio's tablet before I finished the sentence. The producer held up fingers 1025. The website crashed within minutes, then rebooted under emergency servers. Claire announced the tally live: 10,000 pre-orders in under 4 minutes, a record for the showcase. The audience erupted, women on their feet, some hugging strangers, all of them wearing the invisible cuff of recognition. I smiled until my cheeks ached, but inside I was counting heartbeats, waiting for the moment when the camera would cut away and I could breathe again. Back at the boutique, the landline began to ring. Rebecca let it go to voicemail, but the messages piled up like snow against a door. Department stores, canceling spring contracts, citing quality concerns and competitive pressure. One buyer left a terse note that Myers pieces were being pulled from counters effective immediately to make room for Eleanor Grace designs. Rebecca muted the television just as Claire asked me about future plans. Mother reached for the remote with trembling fingers and turned the volume back up. My voice filled the room, steady and warm. I want to build a place where women over 50 can learn the craft, where legacy is not something you inherit, but something you create. The camera lingered on the cuff, then on my face, and for one suspended second I looked straight into the lens as if I could see them watching. The final tally flashed on screen: 25,000 units sold out, waitlist growing. Claire embraced me. The audience chanted my name and the lights dimmed for the next segment. I walked off stage on legs that felt borrowed, the platinum cuff warm against my pulse. In the green room, I opened my phone to a flood of notifications. Suppliers offering credit lines, magazines requesting covers, a foundation asking to partner on mentorship programs. I scrolled until I found the message I was looking for, an email from the bank that managed the dormant trust. The subject line read simply, "Congratulations." The balance had not changed, but the possibility had. I closed the app and slipped the phone into my pocket. Rebecca stood in the boutique showroom long after the broadcast ended, surrounded by display cases that suddenly looked cheap. Mother sat on the bottom stair, head in her hands, the television still glowing with the showcase logo. Contracts lay scattered across the counter like fallen leaves. Each cancellation a small death. Rebecca tried to speak, but the words caught behind the panic that had been building since Christmas. She looked at the platinum phoenix on the screen one last time, frozen in a still image the producers had chosen for the website banner. The stone was flawless, the wings triumphant, the woman wearing it unrecognizable as the sister she had erased. I rode home in the same car, the city lights streaking past like comets. The driver asked if I wanted music. I said no, I wanted silence to listen to the sound of doors opening. The studio had given me a gift bag filled with sponsor products I would never use, but the real gift was the map on my phone, now covered in pins from every state. Each one a woman who had chosen to rise. I thought of the boutique 2 towns away, its windows dark for the first time in decades, and felt no triumph, only the clean certainty of momentum. They didn't realize I wasn't behind them anymore. I was ahead. They didn't realize I wasn't behind them anymore. I was ahead, and the first proof arrived in a plain manila envelope from the bank that had once rejected my loan application with a polite form letter. I was at the studio at 6 in the morning reviewing supplier invoices under the single desk lamp when the courier knocked. The return address was the commercial lending division, the same floor where I had sat 5 years earlier, while a vice president explained that my signature on the Myers guarantee made me a risk. I signed for the package with the same pen I used to initial Phoenix cuffs, my hand steady now. Inside was a single sheet on heavy letterhead assignment of note. The $400,000 $1,000 promissory note, the one forged with my name, had been sold for the sum of $250,000 cash. The buyer of record, Eleanor Grace Myers, trustee. I read the document 3 times to be certain the words would not rearrange themselves. The trust account, still untouched since Daniel delivered the letters, had been the perfect currency. I had walked into the bank the day after the showcase wearing the platinum Phoenix and carrying a cashier's check drawn on the dormant fund. The same vice president who had denied me now stood to greet me, his handshake damp with recognition. He explained that Myers Boutique had missed 3 consecutive payments, triggering a covenant breach. The note was distressed, the property over-leveraged, the board eager to unload. I offered 75 cents on the dollar, non-negotiable, take it or watch the asset foreclose in open court. He countered once weekly, then initialed every page while I watched the ink dry like blood. The assignment transferred not just the debt, but the first position lien on the boutique building, the land beneath it, the fixtures, the inventory, even the trademarked script M that had once been my childhood doodle. I became the creditor, the collateral holder, the silent partner they had never invited to the table. The bank manager slid the executed originals across the mahogany desk and asked if I wanted a celebratory coffee. I told him I preferred tea, then left before he could find a clean mug. Outside, the city was waking under a thin February sun, and I stood on the sidewalk long enough to feel the weight of the folder in my briefcase settle into certainty. Back at the studio, I spread the documents across the workbench, the same surface where I had cut the first Phoenix facet. The lien perfection statement was dated the same day as the showcase broadcast, a cosmic alignment I chose not to question. I hired a commercial attorney named Marisol, who specialized in distressed assets. She reviewed every clause and pronounced the transfer bulletproof. She warned that the Myers family would fight, that emotions ran high when real property was involved, but the paper was ironclad. I paid her retainer from Phoenix Profits and asked her to draft the demand letter on my new letterhead, Eleanor Grace Designs, with the Phoenix logo, now trademarked in my name alone. The letter was simple, 2 paragraphs on cream stock. It notified Myers Boutique that the note had been assigned, that the entire principal plus accrued interest was now due, and that payment in full must be received within 30 calendar days to avoid acceleration and foreclosure. I signed it Eleanor Grace Myers, lien holder, and had it hand-delivered by certified mail with return receipt requested. Marisol included a courtesy copy to their corporate counsel, a firm I recognized from the gala invitation list. I imagined the envelope landing on the same mahogany table where Rebecca had opened her Christmas gift, the wax seal breaking under fingers that had once dismissed me as irrelevant. I did not celebrate. I ordered more platinum wire, scheduled a second shift for Gloria, and answered customer emails until midnight. The Phoenix cuffs were selling faster than we could cast them, but I refused rush fees from retailers who wanted exclusive drops. I wanted the rhythm to stay mine the way breathing stays yours, even when the world tries to steal it. At night, I walked the 2 miles home, the lien documents locked in the studio safe beside the master molds. The city felt different under my boots, the sidewalks wider, the traffic lights kinder. I was no longer the woman who had been escorted out of her own legacy. I was the one who held the key to its collapse. The return receipt arrived on a Tuesday, signed in Rebecca's impatient scrawl. I taped it to the corkboard above my desk next to the map of Phoenix orders that now covered 3 walls. Marisol called the next day to say the Myers attorney had requested an extension citing cash flow challenges from recent vendor disputes. I instructed her to deny it politely. The note contained no grace period beyond the 30 days already granted. She laughed a low sound of admiration and promised to file the acceleration notice if the deadline passed. I hung up and polished a new cuff until the wings looked sharp enough to cut glass. 29 days later, the boutique's lights stayed dark past opening hour. I drove past on my way to a supplier meeting, the windows papered with a handwritten sign, "Closed for inventory." The parking lot was empty except for a single sedan I recognized as Father's. I did not slow down. That evening, Marisol forwarded an email from their counsel, a proposed settlement, offering me half the note's face value in exchange for releasing the lien. I replied with a single line, "Full payment or foreclosure sale." The next morning, the boutique's website went offline, replaced by a holding page that apologized for technical difficulties. On the 30th day, I received a thick envelope postmarked overnight. Inside was a cashier's check for $400,000, drawn on a personal account in Father's name, the memo line blank. I stared at the numbers until they stopped swimming, then called Marisol. She confirmed receipt would satisfy the note and released the lien automatically under the assignment terms. I drove to the bank myself, endorsed the back of the check with the same pen, and watched the teller stamp it paid in full. The lien release would record the following business day. I walked out into sunlight that felt earned the weight in my briefcase, now featherlight. That afternoon, their attorney filed suit in county court, claiming fraudulent conveyance, undue influence, breach of fiduciary duty. The complaint named me personally, seeking to set aside the note assignment and recover the property. I read the filing in Marisol's office, the pages trembling slightly in my hands. She pointed to the exhibit list, the original promissory note, my forged signature, the bank's assignment, the demand letter, the paid check. Every document bore my name in places they had never expected it to appear. Marisol smiled the way a chess player smiles when the opponent realizes the queen is already gone. They sued me with my own debt. Too bad I own it now. They sued me with my own debt. Too bad I own it now. The words still rang in my ears when my phone buzzed on the workbench, the caller ID flashing a number I had deleted from my contacts a year earlier, but never quite erased from memory. It was late afternoon, the studio quiet except for the soft tick of cooling metal, and I let it ring 4 times before the silence felt cruel. I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear without speaking. Father's voice came through, cracked and thin, the way old varnish splits in winter. "Ellie," he said, and the name sounded foreign in his mouth, as if he had practiced it in front of a mirror and still couldn't get the shape right. I waited. He cleared his throat twice, then the plea spilled out like water from a broken dam. "The store is drowning, the lawsuit is bleeding us dry, the vendors won't extend another day." He begged me to intervene, to call off the dogs, to save the only thing he had ever loved more than himself. I walked to the window while he talked, watching snow feather past the glass in slow motion. He spoke of legacy of 50 years built on handshakes and reputation of employees who had families and mortgages. His voice cracked again when he mentioned Rebecca, how she hadn't slept in days, how the boutique's lights stayed on all night because darkness felt like surrender. I listened without interrupting, letting the words pile up like unpaid invoices. When he finally paused to breathe, I asked what exactly he thought I could do. He said money, a bridge loan, anything to buy time until the court ruled. I almost laughed. The same man who had signed my name to a guarantee without asking now wanted my signature on salvation. I told him the courts would decide soon enough, then ended the call before he could beg again. The studio felt smaller after his voice left it. I set the phone face down and returned to the cuff I had been setting, a platinum phoenix with a stone so clear it looked like captured sky. The wings were nearly finished, each feather soldered with the precision I had learned from watching him critique my early sketches. I thought of the gala table, the box, the deed, the way he had smiled at Rebecca while I stood invisible beside them. I thought of the lawsuit filed in panic, the way my name now appeared on both sides of the caption. The balance had shifted so completely that mercy felt like a foreign language. I finished the bezel, wiped the piece clean, and clasped it around my wrist. The stone caught the overhead light and threw it back in a single defiant flare. My phone buzzed again, this time, a text from the same number. "Please, Ellie." One conversation. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I lifted my arm, positioned the cuff so the diamond filled the frame, and took a photograph. No caption, no filter, just the phoenix blazing against my skin. I attached the image and pressed send. The message showed delivered, then read. Seconds stretched into a minute, then 2. I imagined him in the boutique office, the one with the leather chair that swallowed him whole, staring at the screen, while the stone he had once dismissed as sentimental stared back. I had worn the prototype for months, but this was the first time he had seen it finished, the wings sharp enough to cut through every excuse he had ever made. The phone rang again, immediate and urgent. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Silence poured through the line, thick as the snow outside. I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven, the sound of a man recognizing the weight of what he had lost. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. That stone. I told him yes, it was the one Mother had kept in the safe, the one he had told her was worthless because it wasn't big enough for the window displays. Another silence, longer this time. I waited. He asked if I would meet him just once to talk terms. I looked at the cuff, at the way the platinum caught every facet of light and refused to dim. I thought of the Christmas table, the relatives, the moment everything tilted. I said yes, but on my conditions. Christmas Eve, the boutique, 8 o'clock. He started to protest, but I was already speaking over him. Come alone. Bring the keys. I hung up before he could agree or argue. The studio settled back into its familiar hum, the polishing wheel waiting patiently beside the torch. I removed the cuff and placed it in a black velvet box, the kind I used for special orders, and tied it with silver ribbon. I wrote no card. The image had said enough. Outside, the snow had thickened, erasing footprints as soon as they formed. I locked the studio and walked home through streets that felt both familiar and new. The phoenix warm in my pocket like a coal that refused to cool. The lawsuit would proceed. The courts would deliberate. But the real reckoning would happen at the table where it all began. Let's meet on Christmas Eve, where the betrayal began. The snow that Christmas Eve fell in thick, deliberate flakes, each one landing on the windshield of my rental car like a tiny accusation. I had not set foot in this house since the night they handed Rebecca the deed. Yet the porch light still glowed the same amber, the wreath still sagged under its own weight of plastic berries. My father's voice on the phone had cracked like thin ice. Come home, Ellie. Just us. We'll fix it. I had answered with a single photograph, the phoenix glinting on my wrist, and hung up. Now I sat in the driveway, engine off, clutching the manila envelope that held the last piece of the puzzle I had spent a year assembling. The envelope was warm from my grip, the paper soft as old skin. I stepped out, boots crunching the salt they still scattered in the same crooked line, and walked through the front door without knocking. The dining room smelled of pine needles and the metallic tang of fear. The table was set for 4, the same damask cloth, the same crystal candlesticks, the same chairs that had cradled generations of Myers' ambition. My mother stood at the head, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. Rebecca hovered beside her, cheeks flushed from wine or shame. My father rose when he saw me, then thought better of it, and sank back down. No one spoke. I laid my coat over the back of the chair that had once been mine, the one with the carved initial E that someone had sanded away years ago. I took my seat, the envelope centered in front of me like a place card. Merry Christmas, I said. The words tasted like iron. My father cleared his throat. Ellie, we. I lifted one finger. The gesture was small, but it silenced him the way it never had when I was 12. I opened the envelope and slid the first document across the cloth. It was a photocopy, edges crisp, the state seal still sharp. My birth certificate, issued the day I drew my first breath. Eleanor Grace Myers. Born 3:17 a.m. Firstborn child of Richard and Margaret Myers. The ink was faded but legible. I let them look. Rebecca leaned forward, brow creasing. That's not the one on file, I finished. I produced the second sheet. This one carried the same hospital logo, the same date. but the name had been altered with a careful hand. Rebecca Louise Myers. Firstborn. 3:17 a.m. The original Eleanor Grace had been whited out, the correction initialed in my father's looping R. The change was dated 6 months after my 12th birthday. I watched my mother's eyes travel the page, watched the color drain from her face, the way water leaves a glass tipped too far. 12, I said quietly. That's how old I was when you erased me. My father's mouth opened, closed. Rebecca stared at the papers as if they might bite her. I continued, voice steady. The bank required a firstborn guarantor for the expansion loan in 1981. Rebecca was 9. Too young. So you petitioned the county clerk, claimed a clerical error, paid the fee, and swapped us. One form, one notary, one lie that let you borrow against my future while I was still losing baby teeth. I tapped the altered certificate. This is fraud, identity theft, felony weight. Rebecca's wineglass trembled in her hand. You can't prove intent. I don't need to, I said. The intent is in the interest. You never paid the taxes. You deducted the scholarships Rebecca claimed as the eldest child. Every year you filed, you swore under penalty of perjury that she was born first. That's perjury on top of fraud. I slid a third document forward, a ledger printout from the trust I now controlled showing quarterly deposits routed to Myers Boutique under Rebecca's Social Security number. My Social Security number, issued the day I was born, reassigned to her the day the certificate changed. My mother made a sound, half sob, half gasp. We thought it was temporary, she whispered. Just until the loan closed. It closed, I said. And reopened. And reopened again. Every time the store needed cash, you dipped into the lie. My credit score at 16 carried your inventory. My name underwrote your reputation. I designed the spring line in college while you used my signature to lease the second location. I looked at my father. You told me I wasn't made for success. You made sure of it. Rebecca set her glass down hard enough to crack the stem. You're blackmailing us. No, I said. I'm offering mercy. I produced the final sheet, the lien release already notarized, waiting only for my signature. $400,000 of debt poised to vanish. I uncapped a fountain pen, the same one my mother had given me for high school graduation, the one I had used to sketch the M logo they still sold for thousands. I laid the pen beside the release. One condition, I said. You admit it. Out loud. Here. Now, every word. Silence stretched thick as the gravy cooling in its boat. My father's shoulders folded inward. Rebecca's eyes darted to the door, to the window, to anywhere but me. My mother was the first to break. I'm sorry, she said, voice raw. We were drowning. The store was all we had. We thought you'd understand one day. I was 12, I repeated. My father's head dropped. I forged the correction. I paid the clerk. I told myself it was paperwork. His voice cracked. I'm sorry, Eleanor. Rebecca's turn came last. She looked at the lien release, at the altered certificate, at the sister she had never acknowledged as older. I benefited, she said at last. I knew the numbers didn't add up. I let it happen. I'm sorry. The apologies hung in the air, fragile as the snow outside. I picked up the pen. The nib hovered above the signature line. I could sign and walk away with the debt, erase the store safe, the lie buried forever. Or I could tear the release in half and watch them lose everything on the 1st of January. I signed. The ink spread dark and certain. I slid the document across the table. The lien is forgiven, I said. The store is yours to keep. But the truth is mine to keep as well. I stood, the chair legs scraping like a verdict. You said I wasn't made for success. Turns out, I was made to own yours. The Christmas table had been cleared of every crumb of pretense, the apology still hanging in the air like the scent of pine needles and roasted chestnuts. But I was not finished. I reached into the leather satchel I had carried in with me, the same one that once held only a change of clothes and a bus ticket to nowhere, and I drew out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. My father's eyes, watery and defeated, followed the motion. My mother's hand fluttered to her throat. Rebecca sat rigid, Her manicured fingers curled around the stem of a crystal goblet that had gone empty long ago. I laid the envelope in the center of the linen cloth right beside the silver candelabra that had watched every family celebration since I was a child, and I let the silence stretch until it snapped. Inside the envelope were the original incorporation papers of Myers Boutique, the ones my father had filed the day he opened the doors 42 years ago, the ones that bore my looping 14-year-old signature in the margin, where I had sketched the first M logo in purple ink, because I thought it looked elegant. I had requested the originals from the county clerk months earlier, citing a routine audit, and the clerk, bless her, had handed them over without question. They were brittle now, the edges yellowed, the ink faded but still legal, still binding, still the heartbeat of everything they had stolen. I opened the envelope slowly, letting the papers slide onto the table like a magician revealing a final card. Rebecca leaned forward, her breath catching. "What is that?" she asked, though she already knew. I could see it in the way her shoulders drew up, the way her gaze darted to our parents, as if they might still save her. They would not. I had made certain of that when I signed away the lien forgiveness an hour earlier, trading their public humiliation for a clean slate on the debt. Clean for me, at least. The store itself remained theirs on paper, but the land beneath it, the building, the very foundation, now carried my name on the mortgage note I had purchased with the trust my mother had hidden away. They had apologized, yes, but apologies do not pay rent. I stood the chair legs scraping across the hardwood floor with a sound that echoed like a judge's gavel. The fireplace crackled behind me, fed with applewood and the last of the holiday logs, the flames licking high enough to paint the room in shifting gold. I carried the papers to the hearth, feeling the heat kiss my cheeks, and I held them up so everyone could see. My father's handwriting on the first page, my mother's witness signature on the last, and there in the corner, my childish doodle that had become a brand worth millions. I had spent decades polishing cases that displayed other people's names while my own was erased from the story. Tonight, the story rewrote itself. One by one, I fed the pages into the fire. The first sheet curled, immediately blackening at the edges, the ink running like tears before it dissolved into ash. The second followed, then the third, each one a small death of the empire they had built on my back. The room filled with the sharp scent of burning paper, and I watched Rebecca's face collapse in slow motion. First confusion, then realization, then something close to terror. She half rose from her chair, but my mother's hand clamped down on her wrist, holding her in place. Good. Let her watch. Let her feel the heat on her own skin for once. When the last page was nothing but glowing embers, I turned back to them, the firelight flickering across my face. I was calm, calmer than I had ever been in this house, because the weight I had carried for 44 years was finally lifting. "I don't want your store," I said, my voice steady, each word deliberate. "I want women to have theirs." The sentence hung there, simple and absolute, a declaration that needed no embellishment. I had spent a lifetime designing displays for strangers, sketching logos that would never carry my name, polishing stones that would adorn wrists more privileged than mine. No more. The ashes in the grate were proof enough that I could destroy what they loved most. But destruction was their language, not mine. I had something better. I stepped away from the fireplace, my boots silent on the Persian rug, and I picked up the second envelope I had prepared, the one Rebecca had not seen. Inside was a lease agreement freshly drawn by the attorney who had once handled my parents' affairs and now answered only to me. The terms were brutal in their fairness: monthly rent, triple the going rate due on the first, with a clause that allowed immediate eviction for non-payment. The landlord's signature line already bore my name in bold, confident ink. I slid the document across the table until it stopped in front of Rebecca. Her eyes widened as she read the header: Premises Lease, 1427 Oak Street, the address of Myers Boutique. "You still own the business," I said, leaning down so our faces were level. "The inventory, the clientele, the reputation, such as it is. But the building that belongs to the lien holder now. And the lien holder has decided the rent is overdue." I tapped the page. "Sign at the bottom. You can keep operating for now." but every dollar you earn from this point forward will flow through my hands first." Rebecca's lips parted, but no sound came out. My father made a strangled noise in his throat, and my mother simply closed her eyes as if praying the scene away. I straightened, smoothing the front of my blouse, the same silk blouse I had worn the night they handed her the deed, and I walked toward the door. The ashes in the fireplace settled with a soft hiss, and I paused on the threshold, one hand on the frame, the snow outside swirling against the windows like a curtain call. I looked back at Rebecca, still frozen over the lease, her future shrinking to the size of a single signature. "Congratulations, Rebecca," I said, my voice carrying across the room with the clarity of a bell. "You now work for me." The door closed behind me with a click that sounded to my ears like the final lock on a vault. I stepped into the cold night, the snowflakes melting on my cheeks, and I did not look back. The empire they had worshipped was ash, and the one I would build would rise from something far more enduring than paper and lies. The snow had turned to sleet by the time I reached my apartment, the city lights smearing into streaks of gold and crimson across the windshield. I sat in the parked car longer than I meant to, the engine ticking itself cool, my gloved hands still gripping the wheel, as if the night might slip away if I let go. Rebecca's signature was fresh on the lease, the ink barely dry, and yet the victory tasted metallic like blood under the tongue. I had expected euphoria, the kind that makes you laugh out loud in empty rooms, but what settled in my chest was a hollow ache, the echo of a door closing on a house I no longer recognized as home. I told myself it was exhaustion, nothing more, and climbed the stairs to the tiny studio that smelled of turpentine and new beginnings. Sleep refused me. I paced the narrow floorboards, the radiator clanking like an old man clearing his throat. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw Rebecca's face pale, stunned, the pen trembling in her fingers as she signed away the last illusion of control. I had wanted her to feel small the way I had felt small for decades, but the image only tightened the knot behind my ribs. At 3 a.m, I gave up and opened my laptop, the blue glow harsh against the dark. An email notification blinked, a delivery confirmation from the Federal Trade Commission's tip portal. I had sent the message weeks earlier from a burner account attaching lab reports that proved Myers Boutique had been plating 14-carat settings with 10-carat alloy for the past 18 months. The signature line read simply, "A devoted customer." I had not expected it to matter so soon. The phone rang at dawn, the hospital's number lighting the screen. My mother's voice was paper thin, each word scraped raw. "Ellie, please. Coronary care. Room 412. I dressed without thinking, the same coat I had worn to the Christmas table, and drove through streets glazed with ice. The corridors smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights humming like trapped insects. A nurse pointed me down the hall, her eyes soft with the pity reserved for families in crisis. My mother lay propped against white pillows, an IV dripping into the crook of her elbow, the heart monitor beeping a steady, indifferent rhythm. She looked smaller than I remembered, the bones of her wrists sharp beneath translucent skin. She did not waste time on greetings. I sent the tip, she said, the words tumbling out before I could sit. The gold. The FTC. It was me. I stared, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold despite the heated room. Your father started cutting corners after the recession. I signed the purchase orders. I knew. Her eyes, the same gray as mine, filled but did not spill. I thought if I kept quiet, I could protect you from the worst of it. I was wrong. I pulled the visitor chair closer, the legs screeching across linoleum. You could have told me. My voice cracked on the last word, betraying the anger I had rehearsed for years. She shook her head, the motion small, painful. Telling you would have made you complicit. I wanted you clean. She drew a shuddering breath. I wore his lies like a second skin. You wear your truth. The monitor skipped a beat, then steadied. I'm tired of the wait. I wanted to rage, to demand why protection had looked like erasure, why love had been measured in silence and sacrifice. Instead, I sat in the vinyl chair and listened as she recounted the slow rot suppliers paid late purity certificates, forged inventory logs altered in the dead of night. She had kept copies of everything locked in a safe deposit box under her maiden name insurance against the day her husband's greed outran her conscience. That day had come sooner than either of us expected. By noon, the news broke. I watched it on the muted television bolted to the wall. A reporter standing outside Myers' boutique, yellow tape fluttering across the entrance, federal agents in windbreakers, carrying out boxes stamped evidence. The chyron scrolled in relentless red, luxury jeweler accused of fraud, license revoked, pending investigation. Rebecca's face flashed on screen, caught mid-stride as she tried to push past the cameras, her coat collar turned up against the cold. The anchor's voice, tinny through the speaker, detailed the seizure of every necklace, ring, and bracelet in the store, millions in assets frozen overnight. My mother watched with me, her hands still in mine. "They'll trace the tip eventually," she said quietly. "Let them. I'm done hiding." A nurse entered to adjust the drip and my mother's grip tightened. "Go home, Ellie. There's nothing left for you here." I wanted to argue, to promise I would stay until she slept. But the truth was heavier than duty. The woman in the bed was a stranger who had finally spoken my language, and I did not know how to answer. I drove back through streets clogged with midday traffic, the radio looping the same bulletin. Customers who had paid premium prices for substandard gold were already filing claims. Suppliers were demanding payment. The bank was calling in secondary loans. Myers' Boutique, the name that had once opened every door in the city, was now a punchline. I parked beneath the awning of my building and sat in the silence, the engine off the wipers stilled. The victory I had engineered with such precision had arrived, gift-wrapped in federal seals, and yet the triumph felt like ash on my tongue. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing the heart monitor's beep. Inside the apartment, I dropped my coat on the floor and stood at the window watching snow pile against the glass. The city glittered below, indifferent and alive, and I realized with a clarity that bordered on grief that I had won everything they took. The store, the legacy, the lie itself. But I had lost the reason I wanted it. The rage that had fueled me for months had burned clean through, leaving only a hollow space where justification used to live. I pressed my forehead to the cold pain and whispered into the empty room I'd won everything they took, but I'd lost the reason I wanted it. The snow kept falling thick and deliberate, as if the sky itself were trying to bury the city under a blanket of forgetfulness. I stood at the window long after the news vans had peeled away from the boutique's taped-off doors, long after the last headline had scrolled across the bottom of the television screen in my mother's hospital room. The hollow space inside me did not fill. It only grew quieter, the way a house settles after the last guest leaves. I told myself I would go home, brew tea, sleep for the first time in days. But my car turned left instead of right toward the cardiac wing where my father had been admitted that morning. The nurse at the desk recognized me now. She simply nodded and waved me through. His room was dim, the blinds half drawn against the winter glare. Machines breathed for him in soft mechanical sighs, tubes snaking beneath the thin blanket that covered his chest. He looked older than the years I had counted on his birthday cards. The skin around his eyes bruised violet, his lips the color of ash. I had come the first night out of duty, the second out of curiosity, the third because the silence in my apartment had begun to feel like drowning. By the seventh night, I no longer needed an excuse. I brought no flowers, no platitudes, only the steady rhythm of my footsteps down the corridor and the small paper bag from the cafeteria that held 2 cups of coffee black for me, 2 sugars for him, the way he had taken it when I was 12 and still believed his preferences were law. He was awake when I entered, propped against pillows that smelled of industrial detergent. His eyes tracked me across the room, wary but not surprised. I set his cup on the rolling tray and took the plastic chair beside the bed, the one with the cracked armrest that pinched my thigh if I sat too long. We did not speak of the seizure of inventory or the revoked license. Those facts lived outside this room in a world of lawyers and headlines. Here, there was only the beep of the monitor and the occasional cough that rattled in his chest like loose gravel. I sipped my coffee and watched the snow pile against the window ledge, each flake a tiny erasure of the day's sins. On the 10th night, he asked for the sketch. His voice was barely a thread, but the words were clear. In the drawer. Top 1. I opened the bedside table and found a manila envelope, the kind he used to bring home from the office, stuffed with invoices. Inside was a single sheet of construction paper, the edges curled. The crayon lines faded, but unmistakable the swirling M I had drawn at 12 while sprawled on the showroom floor surrounded by velvet trays and the smell of lemon polish. I had forgotten it existed. He had not. The paper trembled slightly in my fingers, the wax still bright where I had pressed too hard with the purple crayon. I kept it, he said, the effort of speaking carving deeper lines around his mouth. You were always the artist. The confession landed between us like a stone dropped into still water. I had spent decades believing my talent was an inconvenience to him, something to be tolerated while Rebecca learned the register and smiled for customers. To hear him name it now in this sterile room with death hovering at the foot of the bed felt both cruel and necessary. I folded the sketch carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket, the paper warm against my ribs. We fell into a routine after that. I arrived after the dinner trays had been collected, when the halls grew quiet and the night shift changed. I read to him from the newspaper sports scores, weather reports, anything that did not mention gold purity or federal raids. He listened with his eyes closed, one hand resting on the blanket, the veins blue and prominent. Sometimes he dozed. Sometimes he asked questions about the city, about the price of gas, about whether the old diner on 5th still served pie on Wednesdays. I answered in monosyllables at first, then in full sentences, then in stories I had not realized I still carried the summer I learned to solder in the back room, the way the diamond dust sparkled under the lamp like fallen stars. On the 14th night, the snow turned to rain, drumming against the window in restless Morse code. His breathing had grown shallower, the monitor's green lines stuttering more often. I sat closer than usual, my knee brushing the bedrail. He opened his eyes and looked at me, not through me, not past me, but directly, as if seeing the child and the woman at the same time. I was afraid, he said. The words came slow, each one costing him. Afraid of failing. Afraid of you outshining me. I started to speak, to tell him fear was no excuse, but he lifted one finger, the smallest gesture of command he could still manage. Let me finish. I swallowed the protest and waited. He told me about the early years, the lean months when the rent on the shop ate half the profits, the way my mother had sold her own jewelry to keep the lights on. He spoke of the pride that curdled into resentment when my designs began to sell faster than his, of the late nights he spent convincing himself that pushing me aside was protection, not punishment. His voice cracked on the word daughter, and for the first time I saw tears track down the grooves of his cheeks. I did not wipe them away. Some things a person must feel to the end. The rain eased into silence. I stood to leave the sketch heavy in my pocket, the coffee long gone cold. At the door, I paused my hand on the frame the way I had paused in the old house weeks earlier. He watched me, the effort visible in the tremor of his lips. I'm sorry, Ellie. He whispered the words barely louder than the rain. And for once, I believed him. The apology was not absolution. It was simply truth offered too late to change the past, but soon enough to soften the edges of the future. I nodded a small movement he might not have seen and stepped into the corridor where the fluorescent lights buzzed like tired angels. The corridor lights dimmed to their nighttime setting as I walked away from his room, the echo of his apology still trembling in the air behind me. I did not cry then. The tears felt too large for the space between heartbeats. Instead, I drove home through streets glazed with melted snow, the city quiet in that pre-dawn hush when even the traffic signals seemed to hesitate. My apartment welcomed me with the faint scent of coffee grounds and the soft tick of the wall clock I had bought the week I moved in. I hung my coat, set the sketch on the table beside the unanswered mail, and finally let the day collapse around me. Sleep came in fragments, each one colored by the green glow of the monitor and the rasp of his breathing. The call arrived at 6:43, the hospital's number stark against the screen. The nurse's voice was gentle, practiced. He passed peacefully just after 5. I thanked her, hung up, and stood in the middle of the room until the kettle screamed. The funeral was small, arranged by the same firm that had handled my grandparents decades earlier. Rebecca attended in black wool, her face a mask of careful grief. My mother sat between us, frail but upright, her hand resting on the casket as if she could still steady his heart. I wore the same coat from the hospital nights, the sketch tucked inside the pocket like a talisman. When the minister spoke of legacy and redemption, I stared at the polished wood and wondered which of us he meant. The will reading took place in a law office that smelled of lemon polish and old paper. The attorney, a woman with silver hair and a voice like warm tea, slid a slim folder across the desk. Inside was the framed sketch, the construction paper now protected behind glass, the purple M vivid against the faded background. A note in my father's handwriting was taped to the back, for the daughter who taught me humility. The words were uneven, written with the tremor I had watched grow night after night. The attorney cleared her throat. The boutique property, the remaining inventory, and all business accounts are to be liquidated. Proceeds to cover outstanding debts, with the balance split equally between Mrs. Myers and Miss Rebecca Myers. The framed sketch is bequeathed solely to Eleanor Grace Myers. Rebecca's lips thinned, but she said nothing. My mother simply nodded as if she had known the contents long before the envelope was opened. I left the office with the frame under my arm and a set of keys in my pocket. The boutique looked smaller in daylight, the windows dark, the yellow tape gone, but the doors chained. I unlocked the padlock, the metal cold against my fingers, and stepped inside. The air was stale thick with the ghost of perfume and the metallic tang of seized gold. Display cases stood empty, their velvet liners stripped away. The safe in the back gaped open like a mouth that had nothing left to say. I walked the length of the showroom, my boots echoing on the marble my father had installed the year I turned 20, and I felt the weight of every design I had ever placed in those cases settle on my shoulders. This was the empire I had toppled brick by brick, and now it was mine to bury. I spent the afternoon alone, rolling down the security gates, taping a simple sign to the glass, closed permanently. The realtor arrived at 4, clipboard in hand, already calculating square footage and zoning variances. I signed the listing agreement without reading the fine print. The numbers no longer mattered. By dusk, the lights were off, the alarm reset for the last time, and I locked the door with a finality that sounded louder than any slam. The keys went into an envelope addressed to the bank, dropped through the night deposit slot on my way home. Myers' boutique was no more. Daniel's letter waited in my mailbox, the envelope heavy with the familiar weight of good stationery. I recognized the handwriting before I saw the return address, the same careful slant he had used on the rusted key months earlier. I carried it upstairs, poured a glass of water I did not drink, and slit the seal with the butter knife I kept on the counter. The paper unfolded to reveal a single page, the ink still wet in places as if he had written it in haste. "Dear Ellie," it began. "By the time you read this, I will be gone. The cancer moved faster than the doctors predicted, but I have no regrets. You gave me back my name when you hired me to polish that first stone, and I leave this world richer for it. The building on Elm Street, the one with the cracked skylight and the leaky roof, is yours if you want it. The deed is with my attorney. Build something that heals. Not for them, not even for you, but for every woman who was told her hands were only good for holding someone else's dream. With gratitude and affection, Daniel." I read it twice, then a third time, the words blurring as the room tilted. The building he meant was the old workshop where I had learned to cut facets under his patient eye, the place my father had fired him from 30 years ago. I folded the letter carefully, placed it beside the framed sketch, and sat in the dark until the city lights came on one by one. The empire was ash, the debts were settled, the name was erased from the marquee. What remained was a choice to carry the bitterness like a trophy, or to lay it down and build something new. I stood at the window, the frame in one hand, Daniel's letter in the other, and felt the shift inside me like ice breaking on a river. The revenge I had savored had turned to dust in my mouth, but the space it left was clean, ready for something sturdier. Maybe forgiveness was the only revenge worth keeping. The framed sketch and Daniel's letter stayed on my windowsill for 3 weeks, catching the pale March light that finally pushed winter aside. I read the deed transfer twice, walked the 3 blocks to the old workshop on Elm Street, and stood inside the dusty space until the skylight's cracked pane painted fractured rainbows across the concrete floor. The place smelled of sawdust and forgotten solder, but the bones were sound, and the silence felt like permission. I hired a crew to rip out the rusted benches, patch the roof, and install long tables that could seat 20 at a time. I painted the walls the color of fresh cream hung task lamps with adjustable arms, and ordered a dozen polishing wheels that spun with the low hum I remembered from childhood. When the sign maker asked what words to etch on the glass, I did not hesitate. Success is for every woman. The letters went up in gold leaf, bold enough to stop traffic. I called it the Grace Institute, a name that carried my middle name and my mother's maiden one, a quiet reclamation of the lineage they had tried to erase. The program was simple, free, 6-month courses in gem-cutting metal smithing and design for any woman over 50 who could fog a mirror. No tuition, no prerequisites, just a willingness to show up with steady hands and an open heart. Applications trickled in at first widows who had sold their own jewelry to pay bills, retirees who had sketched in secret for decades, former teachers who wanted to craft something that lasted longer than a lesson plan. I interviewed them in the back room over coffee and chipped mugs, listening to stories that sounded like echoes of my own. By the time the first cohort filled, I had a waiting list long enough to wrap around the block. The grand opening fell on a Saturday in May, the air soft with lilac and the promise of summer. I wore a linen blouse the color of riverstone and the phoenix bracelet on my left wrist, the diamond catching the sun every time I moved. 20 women stood in a semicircle while I cut the ribbon with the same scissors my mother once used to trim price tags. Cameras from the local station flashed. A reporter asked what inspired the institute. I told her the truth: every woman deserves a second act, and some of us need a third. The applause was polite at first, then thunderous, the sound of hands that had spent lifetimes applauding other people's children, finally clapping for themselves. Rebecca appeared on a Tuesday in June, the sky the color of tarnished silver. I was in the polishing bay showing a student named Marlene how to bring a cabochon to a mirror finish when the bell above the door chimed. Rebecca stood just inside the threshold, thinner than I remembered, her hair pulled back in a severe knot that made her cheekbones sharp. She wore a navy blazer 2 sizes too big and carried a manila folder against her chest like a shield. The phoenix bracelet glinted on her wrist, the stone I had cut from my mother's raw diamond now set in silver that had once been destined for a Myers display. She noticed me noticing and lifted her chin, a gesture I recognized from 100 childhood arguments. "I'm here about the junior polisher position." She said the words clipped, but not cold. I wiped my hands on the apron tied around my waist and led her to the small office that used to be Daniel's storage closet. The folder contained a resume sparse on recent experience and heavy on apologies typed in 12-point font. She had worked odd jobs since the boutique liquidated cashier at a craft store, night clerk at a motel. Anything that paid rent on the studio apartment she now called home. The last line read, "Willing to start at the bottom and earn trust." I closed the folder and studied her face, searching for the sneer that had once come so easily. It was gone, replaced by something raw and careful. "Why polishing?" I asked. She glanced at the bracelet, then back at me. "Because it's honest work. You can't fake a facet." The answer was so plainly true that I almost smiled. I thought of the nights I had spent hunched over wheels just like the ones outside this door of the satisfaction when a cloudy stone finally revealed its fire. I thought, too, of the years she had spent arranging my designs in cases while believing the talent was hers by right. The scales had tipped so far in my favor that refusing her felt like kicking someone already on the ground. I slid an application across the desk. "Orientation is Monday at 8. bring safety glasses, and a willingness to sweep floors. She filled out the form in silence, her pen moving with the same precision she once used to sign purchase orders. When she reached the emergency contact line, she paused, then wrote my name and the institute's phone number. The gesture was small, but it landed between us like a bridge. I hired her on the spot, starting wage, no favoritism paired with Marlene, because Marlene had no patience for nonsense and would keep her honest. Rebecca nodded, folded the carbon copy, and slipped it into her pocket. At the door, she hesitated. "Thank you," she said, the words barely audible over the hum of the polishers. I answered with a nod of my own, and she stepped back into the classroom where the other women greeted her with cautious curiosity. The institute grew roots and wings in the same season. Students brought casseroles on the first day of each new cohort. Graduates left behind small gifts, a carved wooden box, a watercolor of the skylight, a poem tucked into my suggestion box. Rebecca proved steady if reserved, arriving early to oil the wheels, staying late to reset the loops. She asked questions that revealed a mind still quick beneath the humility, and when Marlene praised her first flawless dome, the pride in her eyes was the same shade it had been the night she unwrapped the boutique deed. I watched from the doorway, the phoenix cool against my skin, and felt the circle complete itself in slow, deliberate turns. One evening in late August, I stayed after closing to balance the books. The windows were open to catch the breeze, and the sign glowed softly against the dusk. Rebecca lingered at her station, wiping down the wheel with a chamois cloth. She approached my desk with the tentative step of someone testing thin ice. "I brought something," she said, and placed a small velvet pouch in my palm. Inside was a pendant, a simple silver teardrop set with a tiny sapphire no larger than a pinhead. The bail was hand-forged, the prongs delicate but secure. "For the Institute," she said. "First piece I've made without a blueprint." I turned it over in the lamplight, the stone flashing like a captured star. It was imperfect in the way all first attempts are, but the heart of it was true. I hung the pendant from a chain in the display case by the door, right beneath the sign that proclaimed success for every woman. The next morning, a new student noticed it and asked who the artist was. I told her the truth, a junior polisher who was still learning like all of us. Word spread, and soon the case filled with similar offerings, rings, earrings, brooches, each one a testament to hands that had been told they were too old, too slow, too late. Rebecca's name began to appear beside them, written in her careful script, and I let it stay. Years later, when the Institute had outgrown the workshop and spilled into a second location across town, I still wore the phoenix every day. I walked the aisles between workstations, correcting angles, praising progress, wiping away the occasional tear, when a woman held up her first finished piece and saw her own reflection in the shine. Rebecca had moved up to lead instructor, her voice steady as she explained claw settings to a circle of eager faces. She no longer flinched when our eyes met. Instead, she offered the small smile of someone who has earned the ground beneath her feet. I stood at the window one evening, the city lights flickering on like 1,000 small fires, and I traced the path from the girl who had sketched an M on construction paper to the woman who now taught others to draw their own. They said success isn't for me. Turns out it was for every woman I helped become me. The snow had turned to sleet by the time I reached my apartment, the city lights smearing into streaks of gold and crimson across the windshield. I sat in the parked car longer than I meant to, the engine ticking itself cool, my gloved hands still gripping the wheel as if the night might slip away if I let go. Rebecca's signature was fresh on the lease, the ink barely dry, and yet the victory tasted metallic like blood under the tongue. I had expected euphoria, the kind that makes you laugh out loud in empty rooms. But what settled in my chest was a hollow ache, the echo of a door closing on a house I no longer recognized as home. I told myself it was exhaustion, nothing more, and climbed the stairs to the tiny studio that smelled of turpentine and new beginnings. Sleep refused me. I paced the narrow floorboards, the radiator clanking like an old man clearing his throat, and every time I closed my eyes I saw Rebecca's face pale, stunned, the pen trembling in her fingers as she signed away the last illusion of control. I had wanted her to feel small the way I had felt small for decades, but the image only tightened the knot behind my ribs. At 3 in the morning, I gave up and opened my laptop, the blue glow harsh against the dark. An email notification blinked, a delivery confirmation from the Federal Trade Commission's tip portal. I had sent the message weeks earlier from a burner account attaching lab reports that proved Myers Boutique had been plating 14-karat settings with 10-karat alloy for the past 18 months. The signature line read simply, "A devoted customer." I had not expected it to matter so soon. The phone rang at dawn, the hospital's number lighting the screen. My mother's voice was paper-thin, each word scraped raw. "Ellie, please. Coronary care. Room 412. I dressed without thinking, the same coat I had worn to the Christmas table, and drove through streets glazed with ice. The corridors smelled of bleach and burnt coffee, the fluorescent lights humming like trapped insects. A nurse pointed me down the hall, her eyes soft with the pity reserved for families in crisis. My mother lay propped against white pillows, an IV dripping into the crook of her elbow, the heart monitor beeping a steady, indifferent rhythm. She looked smaller than I remembered, the bones of her wrists sharp beneath translucent skin. She did not waste time on greetings. I sent the tip, she said, the words tumbling out before I could sit. The gold. The FTC. It was me. I stared, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. She reached for my hand, her fingers cold despite the heated room. Your father started cutting corners after the recession. I signed the purchase orders. I knew. Her eyes, the same gray as mine, filled but did not spill. I thought if I kept quiet, I could protect you from the worst of it. I was wrong. I pulled the visitor chair closer, the legs screeching across linoleum. You could have told me. My voice cracked on the last word, betraying the anger I had rehearsed for years. She shook her head, the motion small, painful. Telling you would have made you complicit. I wanted you clean. She drew a shuddering breath. I wore his lies like a second skin. You wear your truth. The monitor skipped a beat, then steadied. I'm tired of the wait. I wanted to rage, to demand why protection had looked like erasure, why love had been measured in silence and sacrifice. Instead, I sat in the vinyl chair and listened as she recounted the slow rot suppliers paid late purity certificates, forged inventory logs, altered in the dead of night. She had kept copies of everything locked in a safe deposit box under her maiden name insurance against the day her husband's greed outran her conscience. That day had come sooner than either of us expected. By noon, the news broke. I watched it on the muted television, bolted to the wall, a reporter standing outside Myers Boutique, yellow tape fluttering across the entrance, federal agents in windbreakers carrying out boxes stamped evidence. The chyron scrolled in relentless red, luxury jeweler accused of fraud, license revoked pending investigation. Rebecca's face flashed on screen, caught mid-stride as she tried to push past the cameras, her coat collar turned up against the cold. The anchor's voice, tinny through the speaker, detailed the seizure of every necklace, ring, and bracelet in the store, millions in assets frozen overnight. My mother watched with me, her hand still in mine. They'll trace the tip eventually, she said quietly. Let them. I'm done hiding. A nurse entered to adjust the drip and my mother's grip tightened. Go home, Ellie. There's nothing left for you here. I wanted to argue, to promise I would stay until she slept. But the truth was heavier than duty. The woman in the bed was a stranger who had finally spoken my language, and I did not know how to answer. I drove back through streets clogged with midday traffic, the radio looping the same bulletin. Customers who had paid premium prices for substandard gold were already filing claims. Suppliers were demanding payment. The bank was calling in secondary loans. Myers Boutique. The name that had once opened every door in the city was now a punchline. I parked beneath the awning of my building and sat in the silence, the engine off the wipers stilled. The victory I had engineered with such precision had arrived gift-wrapped in federal seals, and yet the triumph felt like ash on my tongue. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing the heart monitor's beep. Inside the apartment, I dropped my coat on the floor and stood at the window watching snow pile against the glass. The city glittered below, indifferent and alive, and I realized with a clarity that bordered on grief that I had won everything they took: the store, the legacy, the lie itself. But I had lost the reason I wanted it. The rage that had fueled me for months had burned clean through, leaving only a hollow space where justification used to live. I pressed my forehead to the cold pain and